Hello, thank you. It's great to be here. And I think let's jump into the topic. And as we're about to go, I will first go through some introduction to give some credibility into what I'm actually saying and hopefully make you believe that what I'm saying can be true. Go over some of the downsides of what I think how native development can be actually more inefficient than most cross-platform solutions, how to do it better, or how I would put it is how we do it at Lightyear, and finally go over some key takeaways of all of the above. So let's jump into it. First of all, who am I? My name is Alar, as I said before. I started programming around 2011, and quickly I joined my first position at Skype, actually, where I worked for about a year, and I got a pretty good leap start into the world of product development, and quickly started also learning Android as on the side. Back then, Android wasn't that big of a thing yet, iOS either. Smartphones were only just becoming a thing on the market, and app development wasn't that popular yet. But it really did look like a promising and good start to the product development world. So I worked at Mooncascade for a while, only on Android development, and in 2016, I joined Pipedrive as an iOS developer, where I worked for a bit more than 5 years. So with all of this in total, I've gained about 10 years of experience in mobile development. I've worked as both Android and iOS engineers. I've done cross-platform development in both React Native and Flutter, which are the most popular ones. And this brings me to my current endeavor, which is Lightyear. So who doesn't know Lightyear yet, then you will soon. If we haven't gotten to it yet, haven't gotten to you yet, then we will soon enough, hopefully. But what we are is a low-cost international brokerage. So what does it mean is that we're basically an investing app. We allow you to open multi-currency accounts. We allow you to have access to thousands of instruments, which means individual stocks, ETFs, and so on. And our goal is to create successful and better investors. So if you actually go join Lightyear, and if you feel confident about making your next investment decision using our product, then we have been successful in our product market fit, and this is what we are aiming for. And all of this is available only in the mobile app for now. So why mobile? Let's talk a bit about this. Let me save you the time for counting the numbers. It's 6.9 million smartphone users worldwide. So given that there are a bit more than 8 billion people on Earth, then 6.92 billion is quite a big number and pretty good initial target group for your customers. And saying that 80% of all social media browsing happens on mobile just means how much time absolutely everyone spends on mobile devices. And even though for many of us, scrolling those small screens every now and then and getting this information from such a small device can be inconvenient, then I bet that there are new generations coming that use those smartphones in a totally different way that many of us do, and we, as product developers and product managers, simply have to adapt and learn our way into it. 60% of all traffic nowadays is coming from mobile. Now, this is an interesting number because 10 years ago, this number was only 10%. So it shows how within the last decade, the huge growth of mobile smartphone usages came to be. But this thing is only bound to grow as the technologies that still make the smartphone usage more convenient are advancing on a daily basis. So talking about native development, and before fully saying that native development is inefficient, then I fully don't believe so. But there are definitely some takeaways to think about here. I do believe that most companies and the most apps you use do not need the actual advantages that you have when you are going into native development. You don't need to be that close to the platform and hardware to actually just ship your product that your customers need. So let's go into it a bit and see why I tend to think so. If you are developing your app for two platforms, Android and iOS, you are doing so by creating two different code bases. Now, these use different languages, usually more than 4 languages, just to have those two code bases up and running. And what's most important is the frameworks, because the frameworks that you are using on both platforms are different, and the technical implementation details that you have there are quite different as well, which means that if you are trying to push the same product feature for your single product simply needing to have it on two platforms, you will implement it in two totally different ways. There will be some similarities, but is it really worth it? Secondly, is that initially it seems okay. You will have your code base as quite new. Code is easy to develop, and the new code is quite easy to maintain. Give it a few years, give it quite a bit of time, and it will be increasingly more difficult to actually deal with these misalignments of technical implementations. So when you go to your mobile team, you ask for a small feature change that was developed quite some time ago. One of the teams can easily say 2 weeks, the other one 5 weeks, because simply some technical implementation underneath needs to be changed or refactored because of some technical implementation back then, which only applies to one of the platforms. So this way, when you start having these big misalignments between your platforms, you will really start hurting your development speed, because in the end, you still care about shipping the same product simply on two different platforms. The technical challenges that arrive also include changes from these two platforms. So Apple and Google are doing really good job at pushing new SDK updates absolutely every year. They do at least one major update per year, and maybe a few small minor ones throughout the year as well. But what does this mean to the developers? Is that they will actually need to start implementing those updates in order to get all the benefits from them. This often means changes to hardware usages, permission handling, all API changes, and all these kind of things. And these aren't aligned between two platforms, which again means that one of the platform teams might need some time to actually work on those problems, let's say, while your product roadmap still needs to be in development. Lastly is about the people, and this is by far the most important part of it, as being a good developer is not just an experience you've had or your expertise in a specific field, but you really need to have the right mindset. You need to have people who actually own the problems. They see why it's happening and own the solutions to it up until customers actually have it. This is not easy to find, and what makes it even more difficult is that finding or putting together a whole team of these people with the correct cultural fit. And the latter keyword is exactly why it's really difficult to build teams that work well together. If anyone has dealt with any kind of hiring, you will know that as the team grows, as you need more people, then finding this cultural fit is just increasingly difficult and sometimes even overlooked, because otherwise it's just too difficult to find the right people. Now, next up is how to do better, or how we do it at Lightyear. So the examples here are simply how we do things. We haven't found a new way of working. We haven't magically found some rabbits in our hats, but I think we do show a good case of some existing solutions that we have implemented that really help us develop things at really quick speeds. So our first magic keyword of the day is Flutter, and I think I could easily say that at least half of the problems from the last slide is simply solved by going cross-platform. So let's go into this. If someone doesn't know who Flutter is yet, I'll quickly recap. Flutter is an application development framework, which means that you will need to only create one code base using one language, which is Dart in case of Flutter, to create and maintain your application. And based on this, you can start shipping it on all of those different platforms, including Android and iOS, but also web, macOS, Linux, Windows, and so on. The list is often updated with new platforms where Flutter can be run. Now, why is this good? Is that you just have to write your code base once. You only need this one team to work on it, and you can start shipping your features with just one development cycle. You have no worries about releasing features in parity because they are being developed in parity. As you start going into it, a lot of people also start asking about maybe the code getting messy, or you will get a lot of if-elses based on platform checks within the code. Then I would proudly say that this is not the case. And I used to also be one of the most anti-cross-platform people in ByteDrive back then. And when I was a native developer, as I simply thought it's impossible to work on two platforms and still have this native feel. But Giving it some time, it's now pretty difficult to get me out of Flutter, I would say, as the development speed is just amazing compared to native development. And I also checked how many platform checks we have in our app right now, which is, for Lightyear, it's about 2 years old, and maybe around a bit over 100,000 lines of code by now. And we have about 7 or 8 different use cases for platform checks. And mostly, these are just different strings, like showing Face ID instead of biometrics, or directing people to Google Pay instead of Apple Pay when depositing. So I wouldn't really say that this creates a messy code, but rather just some simple things. Also seen in the video is some small improvements that you can have this native feel with, is, for example, the back button, where you can have chevron on one of them and back arrow on Android, for example. You can start including the transitions to be more native-like, and have generic components like bottom sheets and generic button layouts and so on, which would really bring in the native feel, and the users wouldn't even understand that this is something that is being developed in cross-platform, which means that you will start developing more platform-agnostic solutions, and your design language is more and more of your own instead of the one that the platform SDKs are giving you. Now, lastly, don't reinvent the wheel. It's easy to say, but absolutely every development project will need some kind of dependencies. If you have 2 code bases, you will create a different set of dependencies for these 2 platforms. But when going for Flutter, you will only have one. And this is very easy. This is a lot easier to maintain, and you don't even have to care about the dependencies that they are using underneath. So they might still be using those native ones below, but you, as simply the Flutter package user, won't really care about that. Our next keyword of the day is automation. So absolutely everything you do repetitively or a few times more in the exact same way, you should always automate. It will always save time, and the easiest example here is the release cycle. So why the release cycle is that most of the tools, CI tools that mobile development has, they first of all start supporting release cycles, like Fastlane, for example. It's one of the easiest things to automate with very little effort, but you will start saving a lot of time. Next up is internal beta builds. We have implemented internal builds for our employees and internal testers in a way that every time a push happens to the master branch or a pull request is merged, we will get an internal build for ourselves. Now, why is this good? Is that we are keeping our master branch releasable. We never care about when we need a release, but we are often always testing the latest build internally. And this way, when you actually need to make a release at one moment, you are ready to do so, as most of the changes have been tested properly anyway. Next up, about auto-formatting and code analysis, is simply the fact of how teams communicate with other teammates. And I think I haven't seen a team yet that hasn't thought about code styling and argumenting about how some lines should be formatted. Easiest thing to do, automate it, and problem solved. What's nice about this as well is that these things often allow for custom rules. And all of these custom rules have to be implemented via pull requests and in the code, which means that all of these changes have to be approved by the team, and the changes to them will happen via pull requests again. Which also brings us to our last point, documentation. Now, I think most teams have also seen the case, at least in mobile development, is that when a new team member joins, what's always very nerve-wracking about joining is that they have to learn how to release your app. And every time someone has to sit down with them, go through with it, maybe show some Confluence page that will show the whole process, what to tap and where, and what has to be green and red there and there. Then as soon as you automate it, this code that runs the automation will work as documentation. You don't really need to care that much about writing all of this down as a process when your process is actually written in code. And we, as developers, really like to read code, which means that we actually will understand how this release build gets made. And this is not only about the release cycle itself, but also the internal builds, formatting rules, everything around that is written in code. If something is triggering and running it, then every new team member or anyone interested within the company can read this code, and this is the documentation for your process. And what's even better exactly as it was with the custom rules before is that all of the changes to these internal processes will also happen via pull requests and reviews within your team. So nothing can happen secretly behind some closed doors or without anyone noticing. Lastly, if you do this with Flutter, you just need to do it once, which is easy enough. Of course, there are some slight setups that you need to do for both Android and iOS to support the app stores, but most of these builds and most of the tooling that allow for it, you have to just set it up once. Because again, doing it on 2 different platforms will just give you twice the trouble and twice the code for actually implementing it. Lastly is about the design system. So we at Lightyear have started implementing a pretty heavy design system for our app. This means that we have our own set of component library, we have our own custom theme, and we have our own color palette that we are using, which is semantic. Now, starting with the above, you should always start generalizing any kind of components you use, right? Like buttons, text, links, and so on. This is easy enough to do, but the way that we have done it is that we aren't simply generalizing the UI components, but we are also sitting down with the designers of our team, and every now and then we are agreeing to how exactly these elements should behave like, how should they look like, and what are the different styles that you can use this button as. Which means that every time a designer uses this button, you won't have to rethink some of the same questions again of how will it behave when it's expanding or how will it behave when you tap on it. Everything is thought through and nothing will change. And for you as a developer, you can just implement these components by basically putting together puzzle pieces, at least for most of the feature development cycle. As you have some smaller components ready, you can easily move on to bigger ones, like whole layouts, cards, bottom sheets, and stuff like this. When you have quite a nice component library ready, that would include basically these things, you can start having at least half of your feature development just by putting those puzzle pieces together really easily and doing the rest that the designer has thought of next. Now, what really helps us as well is custom themes. Now, we haven't limited ourselves to what the platforms give about dark and native themes, but we have implemented our own custom theme system, which means that absolutely every view will get access to the theme it's currently being built in. Meaning that we don't really know if the user is currently in dark mode or light mode or in some third mode that we can reintroduce later, but they simply have access to the colors that they need to use. Now, with the next button, next bullet point, which is the semantic color palette, really makes it as useful as it is. So when you have background color, then it will be different for every theme that the user is in. Is it dark, light, or is it something third? What makes it really nice and what makes it start saving you a lot of time is any kind of rebranding or repositioning in your design language, as it tends to happen quite often where designers want to change some subtle little things, then it can become really annoying for some mobile apps to implement, because you have to go through quite a lot of feature code to make sure it's all working and if all the colors actually work together. When you have these custom themes, and each theme has its own color palette, and each theme has its own set of fonts and font sizes and weights, then this makes it really easy, as the designer has already thought of all of this, and you don't have to touch any of the feature code when doing those changes. You just have to implement another theme and slowly switch over to the new one. Now, all of this takes a lot of effort, and it's not easy. It's not only up for you as the development team to implement this, but also getting in designers, also getting in product managers to have this allocation of resource to do this implementation. But in the long run, it's really going to pay off. And the bigger your app grows, the more you will have the need for something like this. So starting off when the app is actually small enough is a really good idea to save a lot of time already in the beginning, although it can seem like quite a hassle upfront. So what next? Cross-platform is not always the answer, so I wouldn't push for going cross-platform right away. I definitely do recommend to think about it really heavily. If your app is in a place where you can actually rewrite, or you are writing a new app from scratch, I would really start thinking if you need all of the benefits for actually being in a native environment versus all of the up points that you can get when going cross-platform. Again, I don't think most apps need all of this advantage of being native, and you can save yourself a lot of time by having just one code base to maintain. If you're looking for something, then I would of course recommend Flutter. If you don't have enough JavaScript in your life, you can go for React Native as well, and that's it. Automating everything you can absolutely automate. It will save a lot of time early up, and it will save a lot of time in the end when you actually need to change your processes. Design system. Always build your heavily reusable components and talk them through with their designer. It doesn't make sense if you do it only internally within your development team, as there will be some misalignments of different paddings, margins, fonts, and so on. If your designer knows what kind of reusable components you are using, then he or she can also start using them appropriately. And lastly, you shouldn't just hire developers, but actually build a team. Once you have people in your team that really start owning the problems that you have, going for the solutions that are necessary, and trust each other while doing so, then you can start really achieving great things, like we are doing so at Lightyear. This is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alar, so much for your super pretty design of the slides. I enjoyed them very much.
I did it myself without the help of designers. So
really? You're so talented. I mean, my slides look awful, so it was very nice to see. I also saw that you're wearing slippers.
Yes.
Is it because you want to show off your school's Lightyear socks?
A little bit, yes. But also I wanted to feel convenient, as I'm in a working environment, in an office, so I would be in my own little element.
Oh, so it would feel like at home. Good hack, good hack. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Thank you. First, you seem to be burning because there is smoke behind you. Second, you talked a lot about pros or pluses of this framework, but you know that in reality it can be positive all the way. And from my experience, I used multiple cross-platform framework like Adobe PhoneGap, Xamarin, now .NET MAUI, and there are some issues with such frameworks. For example, problems often occur between layers. Mm-hmm. And what are the main cons of Flutter for you, for your team?
The main con of Flutter is how it's built up and how it's actually working. Is that if I bring out React Native as an example, then React Native maps all of its elements, UI elements, to the actual native ones. So that if the React Native app is built, it's actually using the UI button underneath and button from Android System Library underneath. But for Flutter, it's like a game. It's just one screen, and it is rendering all of those objects there and like basically printing it out like a game, which means that you don't have access to native elements. So the problem here can be that since it's rendering all of them at the same time as it's being built and shown and animated, then performance is definitely one of the key things to take a look at Flutter. Although I would say that this has been worse in the beginning years of Flutter. In the last year or two, this has really gone away, and the Flutter team is really heavily doing work to reduce this. By now, you can try downloading the Lightyear app and see how it works for you. We are supporting down up to iOS 12, at least from iOS side. And even on older devices, we rarely see any lag with our app usage.
And what about Dart language?
Dart as a language, yeah. Dart as a language, it's great. Like it's really easy to learn. I can't give a good comparison. I think I've done quite. If you know programming, you will learn Dart really quickly, and it's developing with the same speed as Flutter itself. Hiring developers for Flutter or Dart, yes, that is difficult. But for example, we are a team of 4 mobile engineers. I was the only one initially, and now the 4th one also had some experience with Flutter and Dart in general. The first 2 people who joined before me had never had any experience, but they could still easily pick up Dart and Flutter development without having any experience about it.
And with that, I'm I need to unfortunately cut you. I know that there are some other questions, but we can't take them. I'm so sorry, but you can always reach out to Alar.
Yes, I'll be around in the evening and now, so catch me and ask me.
Yes, and thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. And